Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. My presentation will be on Blue Team tips for Scorecard and how to use Scorecard and OpenSSF project as a producer, as a first-party producer of open source software. My name is Raghav Kaul. I work at Google on the Google Open Source Security team. I am a maintainer of Scorecard and a contributor to Allstar. So if you haven't heard of Scorecard by now, OpenSSF Scorecard is an automated tool to assess the security best practices of an open source repository. I emphasize automated as opposed to self-attested because Scorecard focuses on what we can reason about by looking directly at a project and at the forge that produces the software. We run a series of automated checks on a source code repository and score it out of 10. And we go from 0 to 10, 10 representing a perfect score where Scorecard can't find any improvements to the project, and lower scores indicating a higher degree of risk with the practices the project follows. In the end, the score that the project gets from 0 to 10 is an aggregate of all those factors. There are a couple of modes in which you can run Scorecard. Scorecard can be used as a developer tool, as a CLI tool that you can point at your open source project and scan and analyze it. But we also integrate as a GitHub action into the workflow, into the developer workflow of the project. For a more easy to use or visually friendly interface, we also scan all 1.2 million critical open source projects that are in our database regularly and publish these results to the Scorecard API, a public BigQuery dataset. And we visualize these results through a web viewer. The main project is a Go library and a CLI tool, and we also operate the infrastructure for the public scan. As I mentioned, there is a GitHub action and a web app, and they're all under the OpenSSF. Who is Scorecard for? We can think of two use cases for Scorecard. The first is you are a maintainer of an open source project who wants to secure their project from tampering or typo squatting or drive-by PRs, make it less likely that malicious code can make its way into your open source project. This person would use tools like Scorecard and the best practices badge. The second is you are a consumer of open source software dependencies. This person wants to know whether the software they use is compromised. This person would also use tools like Scorecard or Guac or Salsa or Scorecard Monitor. But in this talk, we focus on use case 1. In particular, we want to help people managing the really large number of first-party open source software they publish. So you have hundreds or maybe thousands of first-party open source projects, and you want to use Scorecard to manage them. How can you think about this? You can break down the problem into a couple of pieces. First, do you have an inventory of assets, a list of all the GitHub organizations or all the first-party code on GitHub? Do you have access to those repositories in those organizations? Second, can you clearly tell who owns a particular project or organization? Is there a team or an individual that's responsible for that organization? Who should know about the scorecard findings for that repository? Third, you should define a policy. How often do you want to refresh the scorecard results? How often do you want to stay up to date with the score of the repository? Are there any repositories you don't care to scan or that are exempt? And finally, remediation. Are the scorecard scores going up over time? Are you telling developers? Are they fixing the issues? Are they being seen by a human at all? This is where Allstar is useful. Allstar is a sister project to Scorecard that is a GitHub app that can run Scorecard plus other checks at scale. I would recommend that you check out the presentation by my colleagues Jeff and Steven on the Scorecard universe from Sauce Fusion. But Allstar helps us on several points. Allstar is installed on an entire organization of repositories. Allstar can also set policy for what it should scan or not, and can automatically remediate issues. In some cases, you may want to operate your own Allstar instance. Why is that? You may not want to give the main Allstar instance that the OpenSSF operates for free access to your project. It's possible to separate Allstar into two parts for easier operation. First is the image. The OpenSSF publishes an Allstar image in addition to running the free Allstar instance, but it's possible to choose specific versions to deploy. Second, you may be able to deploy your own, seeing as Allstar is infrastructure or platform agnostic. Changes in the upstream code won't trigger redeployment unless you want to. This is one model that's available if it's necessary for security. And if you look into the logs that Allstar produces, you'll see structured results. This can make it easier to consume those results or consume those findings. If you want to see information about a specific finding, as in those 18 checks that we talked about earlier, you can go deeper into the structured output. However, there's a problem. Developers who are using open source for the first time are inevitably going to introduce vulnerabilities. And if they're developers using open source, they're also going to want to move fast. Eventually, those vulnerabilities are going to grow out of control, and Allstar will constantly be pinging them to fix them. As a blue team, this will become unmanageable. It's faster to introduce a new vulnerability than to fix it. In DevOps, there's a term, shifting left, that refers to placing a problem earlier in the developer lifecycle. So why shift scorecard left? First, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Particularly for some vulnerabilities, it's easier to fix them and takes shorter time earlier. Second, there's a lower developer cost to fixing. They don't have to receive some kind of alert or notification that the scorecard score or scorecard finding found something and then go back to fix it. Creates all these costs. So eventually it'll become much easier if you can shift closer to where the developer is and show them their scorecard findings. This is where Scorecard Action helps. Scorecard Action is a GitHub action you can run and install on your project. It's triggered by webhook events on your GitHub repository, and then it publishes those results to an API. But Scorecard Action is particularly useful for one class of issues, dangerous patterns in GitHub workflows. GitHub workflows is a fairly openly defined workflow definition language. It's possible for a drive-by PR to exploit vulnerabilities in GitHub workflows through user-controlled parameters. For example, a malicious contributor can open a fake PR to a project that contains an injection in something like the title of the PR or the PR body. The PR here means pull request. Another vulnerability in GitHub workflows is the usage of the pull request target trigger with an untrusted checkout. This will lead to the execution of user-submitted and unreviewed code as part of the build process and can lead to exfiltration of tokens. This is a perfect use case for Scorecard Action. Because Scorecard Action can respond to webhooks, blue teams can use the action to shift detection to the left so that we catch the dangerous workflow patterns before they're even merged. Allstar can also detect these patterns, but again, there's the benefit of catching them earlier as opposed to catching them as a continuous scan. What would it look like to use Scorecard Action? Installing Scorecard Action on your project is as simple as opening a single PR and adding a single file. But to use Scorecard Action on your project as a pre-merge check, you can install the action and then notice that it will comment on your pull request when you make a change that it detects as too privileged. So here, Scorecard Action produces an inline comment with a warning that the permissions for this workflow is too privileged. In fact, we can turn this finding into a pre-merge check. So you can't merge without passing. Scorecard Action can produce a status check, and that status check can be marked as required to pass. We can use this to roll out scorecard. We can roll out this scorecard check at scale using a feature that GitHub calls repository rules. This is some sample HCL code that we use that uses the Terraform provider for GitHub. The required check must pass before merging. So considering Allstar versus Scorecard Action, which one should you choose? For a single project, it makes much more sense to use the action. You can add it with a single PR, it's a single file, and it runs. The difference between Allstar and Scorecard Action is more about the deployment model of your security check. So as a blue team, the more repos that you manage, the more projects that you manage, the bigger your usage is, the more you want to use Allstar. With a GitHub app like Allstar, it's possible to add more detections or make bug fixes to Allstar without the users manually updating their workflows. However, this makes it operationally more difficult because you have to manage the uptime for a running service. With a GitHub action, instead of just click to configure and install the app, you add a file, but with a large number of projects, this becomes a whole migration, telling all your developers to enable the workflow and telling all of them to check in this file into their project. So this is somewhat more time-consuming and more expensive. So putting it all together, how can you build an entire program using Allstar and Scorecard and using these capabilities? Before starting with the tools, try to make things secure by default. Let GitHub handle the things that it can handle for you. For example, you can use repository rule sets to enable branch protection or enable it at an organization level. You can require single sign-on so that you don't have to worry about managing access. Second, once you get started with tooling, you may find that there's multiple tools. You may be using Scorecard here and then using OSV there. You may be using another vulnerability scanning tool. Maybe you have another linter. Try to balance which tools handle what. Scorecard is looking at a lot of things. It's looking both at the code and the configuration of the project. You don't want it to bother a developer with multiple issues, so think about the overlaps. Third, build consensus on the policy. What should you scan? What should be left out? And in general, you want to allow people to experiment. And finally, you can use infrastructure as code for actuation. Thank you for attending. I hope this talk was helpful. And if you're interested in Scorecard or Allstar, please contribute or join the community.